Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us after this short break. I hope that you enjoyed Belgrade in this very nice weather, I would say. We are going to have a workshop on the book of Donatella della Porta, but not the most recent book, but the book which is named Where Did the Revolution Go? And I think I would like to explain why we choose that book, although some others appeared in the meantime. As a group for social engagement studies in past, let's say, 4 years, we were deeply engaged into discussion what is society that we want, what kind of society we want. Is there any kind of utopia that we should head to or we should have in mind when we are discussing basically what kind of society we want? And in all these discussions, which were really sometimes really difficult and challenging, because we are all coming from different disciplines, from philosophers to anthropologists, sociologists, even linguists and historians, we somehow tried to define what is social engagement for us in the first place. And as one of the, I would really say, key question which appeared in those discussions was, is the revolution the solution? Or maybe all this what we know as revolution is only evolution? So when we when we saw the book, we felt that that is something which can really contribute to our also discussion and our development as a group for social engagement in all our thinking. And that is basically the reason why we choose this book. Also, as social movements are probably the key actors of social engagement. If we think about social engagement in general, people usually think of movements when we say engagement, especially social engagement. This book somehow really nicely connects three, I would say, key notions or three concepts: revolution, which is obviously interesting for us; democracy, which is obviously something which we're all interested in, whether we can advance this democracy or we have to challenge this democracy, and social movements as the actors who are somewhere in between. So I think that from my point of view, this book gives one really good overview, especially having in mind empirical evidence which is lying behind all this, what is presented in the book. And that was basically our intention, why we selected it and why we want to have some, let's say, deeper discussion about concepts and findings which you presented in the book. I would present our colleagues who are invited here, especially somehow to give contribution in this discussion. Basically, with all, I would say, with all prominent guests, we are organizing this kind of event, choosing some paper or some book to discuss. We believe that that is really productive for all of us. So we invited our colleagues here who are in a way dealing with the social engagement in different ways, even social movements very directly, some of them. And we have Danijela Dolenec here, coming from Faculty of Political Sciences in Zagreb. We have Srđan Prodanović, our colleague from Group for Social Engagement Studies, as well as Marjan Ivković. Their background is sociologists, but I would say that they are moving more towards critical theory, philosophy, and theory of reason, I would say, in the case of Srđan. Then we have behind Jelena Vasiljević, whom you met yesterday as a panelist, who is she hates to say that, but she's an anthropologist in some basic vocation, but she's dealing with citizenship studies and solidarity. Irena, who is my dear co-organizer of this event, who is a political scientist and basically dealing with deliberative democracy and movements. And we have guests here, very dear guests from our partner institution, Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka, where you will meet them again in 2 months. So we have here Filip Milačić, who is a fellow now there with PhD from Humboldt University of Berlin. He was actually a PhD student to Wolfgang Merkel also. We have Tiziano Toracca, who is coming from University of Perugia, but now also a fellow at Rijeka. And we have Barbara Niskac, who is coming from University of Ljubljana. And they are all fellows in the current program of Center for Advanced Studies, which is dealing with social engagement. So that's very, very linked to the thing which we are doing here, and I think that they can give a nice contribution to today's discussion. I wouldn't prolong my talking anymore. I would give you floor to briefly say why revolutions from your point of view, and then we will collect the comments and questions from discussants and open the floor in the end for the people from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who read the book. One of the fear when we write books is that nobody will read them. So she forced you to read it, and I'm looking forward to debating it with you. So Gazela asked me to open the discussion saying something also about what prompted me to work in a field which is bridging my own fields of social movements with other fields of scholarship. And as it happens with several projects, there were different inputs. On the one hand, I come from a country who also had difficult relationship with democracy, democratized quite late, and the impact of the forms of democratizations are, I think, still there. I studied in different moments issues of quality of democracy, and for the ERC project, when I applied, I wanted to go a bit beyond my own field of expertise. But I think that's one of the events which really made me thinking about the questions, where did the revolution go, was the fact that I was in Berlin between 1988 and 1993. And what I saw was something that kept being repeated also in 2011 with the Arab Spring, and it was sudden emergence of very strong movements, people who filled in the streets. Unexpectedly, I was in Berlin for 1 year before the events. We watched television news, what was happening in Leipzig, for instance, in Lipsia, Montag demonstrations, every week becoming stronger and stronger. But there was no feeling, even if I was in a group studying social movements, that something important was going to happen. To the opposite, a colleague of mine has lost the trust of his family-in-laws because he told them just a few days before the breakdown of the GDR that one-party system are very strong, so that there was no revolutions or no democratizations to be expected there. And so one of the issues was, how does it happen that these events happened so suddenly? How does it happen that people, rather than being afraid and being scared away by repressions, are instead motivated by repressions to go more and more in higher and higher number in the streets? So until November, there was 1989, there was very little expectations of big changes. Since November, there was the feeling that nothing would be the same again. But at the same time, I was there long enough to see also the disillusionment. And this is the questions about where did the revolution go. So what happened was that the breaking down of the regimes had open spaces for innovations, creativity, for ideas of rewriting the constitutions of Germany and doing it so that not only real socialism but also real existing democracies could be overcome by a common effort. There were institutions which were made, there were experiences of strong participations, because when the regime broke down, it meant that also at the local level there was the need for organizing things, and citizens mobilized. But at the same time, what activists later told me also during the interviews, what they saw was that immediately there was electoral politics which was introduced, and what they say was an election after the others, and that electoral politics is not welcoming for social movement activists. Germany was a bit of a special case because there were the parties coming from Western Germany that went in mass in Eastern Germany, but it is also true for other countries that those who were very strong in the squares were not so strong in electoral politics, and that the disillusionment was very strong. It was extremely strong in the former GDR, where activists had expected that they could build a third way, and instead they felt colonized by the West. But this story was quite common. So the questions that re-emerged also in 2011 when watching at Egypt or Tunisia was, how does it happen that people are in the streets very courageous, very challenging, very creative, but then we have the impression that the revolution disappears. So is it an illusion? Because the journalists, especially the foreign journalists, tend to focus on normal politics that they understand better. It is something which has no long-term effects, or there are seeds which are spread during these moments of changes that tend to be reproduced. And so looking at the similar processes in between, there had been also a new wave of democratizations, or something which was expected to be a new wave with the Arab Spring in 2011. So the questions was at the same time, what prompts, what explains an acceleration of time, these observations by and feelings by many that nothing will be the same again, and what explains instead what I called in the book also deceleration of time, so normalization of time. And the questions, did it really disappear, is also related to another questions which I developed during a previous part of the research, which is which type of impact the specific mode of transition has on the quality of democracy later on. So I tried to bridge different literature. One of these is the literature on democratizations, but also destabilizations of democracies, so democratic qualities. And the reference to the revolutions is a reference especially to events which produce breaking points, turning points, quick and deep turning points that have been defined as critical junctures and so on. So I touched upon literature and revolutions, but observing that this literature changed a lot in times, because the very first research on revolutions were focusing on few events, typically Barrington Moore or Theda Skocpol, so it was social type of revolutions, and it was through violent means. Nowadays we consider revolutions also as just political type of transformations, and just also peaceful type of transformations. But what interested me was the fact that for the activists themselves, it was considered as a breaking point, and it was understood as a breaking point in the society at large. So terms like the purple revolutions, orange revolutions, jasmine revolutions, carnation revolutions before in Portugal, all pointed at these expectations of changes. And in my own previous research on the development of transitions, what I had noted was that there were different paths of participations of civil societies in democratization processes. So that while these participations of civil societies had been disregarded in democratization literature because it had been considered as just a disturbing factor, and in social movement studies because social movement studies assumed that you needed democracy before you could have social movements. What I saw was that movements were present in the different forms of transitions, but in different ways, so that there were participated pact or pacted transitions in which movements were not mobilized. Poland, Hungary are such examples. And that there were instead what the literature called as transitions by rupture, and which I called eventful forms of transitions, in which movements mobilize massively, and they give these perceptions that there is a breaking point and transformations. And so what I tried to do was to look at the questions of where did the revolution go, thinking in terms of effects of the modes of transitions on the quality of democracy. And in short, my answer in the book is that yes, it has an effect, that the mode of transitions. No, revolutions did not totally disappear, but there were different types of mechanisms that produced different types of effects in terms of qualities. And what was counterintuitive in the results of the research was that while scholars of democratizations had usually assumed that the physiological forms was a pact, was elite agreeing with each other, what emerged from my research, or at least I think that it emerged from the results of the research, is that it was rather the opposite. Thank you. That rupture was important in increasing the qualities of democracy, especially for those qualities that are relevant for the development of civil societies. So I looked at the typical martial type of rights, political rights, civil rights, and social rights, comparing pacted transitions or participated pact with eventful transitions. And what I noted was that the quality of democracies in terms of capacity to stimulate participations by the movements are increased in processes by ruptures. just a word on the methodological side. I've used comparative historical analysis, so I've been relying on existing scholarship, but also I've done oral interviews with the help of collaborators, because I thought that what's important was also to look at the ways in which the activists themselves perceived the events, because the perceptions, the constructions of external reality is important in order to explain also the reactions by the activists. And from the point of view, from the methodological point of view, also what I found challenging, stimulating, and useful for me in this process was the attempt also to compare beyond area studies. So Central Eastern Europe case, comparing Central Eastern European cases with the Arab Spring, but also in other research with Southern Europe, I think helped also to go beyond the typical stereotypes, bias that area studies tend to develop, and finding not common causes, but common type of causal mechanisms that could explain these two elements of intensifications of times, intensifications of histories, and instead the development of the perceptions that the revolutions disappeared.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive introduction. I would, without further ado, I will give the floor to discussant, and I invite Srđan to start.
So, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to debate this rather important book. I have a general methodological and theoretical questions, questions that pertain to that part of the book. Namely, it seems to me that a lot of effort was put in developing a more holistic approach towards social movements and social changes. Most importantly, regarding those age-old sociological dualisms between structural or actor approach, determinism, indeterminism, etc. And the way out of it, as you see, is that we need to focus on relational dynamics of contentious actors before, during, and after regime change. Now, this has a striking resemblance to complexity theory. And I know that you wrote also about global justice and things like that. So I was wondering, there we also have recursive micro-level transactions that give rise to emergent social properties. So I was just wondering if you could explicitly just state your position towards complexity theory, and in which way, because you talk about a lot of causality, because causality in complexity theory is not the same as a regular way of thinking about causality. So that's the methodological question. The second hypothesis that you said was that parts of mobilization during the episodes of mobilization have consequences on the way of the qualities of the regime that ensues. Now, I think that this parts of mobilization is also predetermined by ways of communication, because in some sense, when we look at historically, whenever there was a change in the way that people communicate, for example, when the price of the press of issuing new books fell down, then we had a huge surge in social engagement, and we had those conventional violent revolutions in some sense. Now, and the main thing was, back then, everybody became a reader, and that was a key shift. Right now, we have another shift. Social media is giving us the opportunity to be an author. Everybody is an author. So I was just wondering, especially because on the end of the book you debate these new kinds of revolutions which are governed by, fueled by social media. So in which way this shift towards being an author will change in the organization of of social movements and also, consequently, the regimes that ensue. And finally, I was wondering about people or groups that cannot be easily organized into social movements. For example, migrants or refugees. So what would you say about how to approach this group of disenfranchised people? So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Srđan. Danijela, and after you, then we will give the word to
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. So just to clarify the genre, so is Donatella supposed to answer all of our questions? Because I think it's too much, you know? 8 people with like a barrage of questions. Maybe give you an opportunity to just whatever.
I stay 1 month. And
I don't know, I'm just,
I just have to say to this that we had I think 15 discussants when Judith Butler was here, and we almost killed with the question. So
I just thought to, have a meta comment on the genre, because I wouldn't want to be in Donatella's position. I think it's very uncomfortable. But anyway, okay. So first, I would have a general comment on how you introduced it, Gazela, with respect to where did the revolution go, and just kind of direct our attention to the fact that just in the last 2 months. There's been a book published by Jan Zielonka for Oxford University Press, which is called Counter-Revolution, and which talks about the decay of the political center, which is and he envisages the counter-revolution being the illiberal one. So I wanted to kind of throw that in. And also I mentioned this last night as well, that Ivan Krastev wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs calling it Eastern Europe's a long revolution, and again thinking of the same thing. So it is somehow maybe related to this conversation, and maybe we can pick that up in the general discussion. Now, vis-a-vis what I want to comment about this book, and I'll kind of carry on from the conversation that we had in the break. One of the main values I see in this book is that it counters the narrative that at least political science students are taught. Of which I'm by habitus part of, and that's the general story of the fear of the masses, and kind of this idea that too much mobilization is a threat, and what Donatella does in her book is kind of, create a kind of a tension, but a positive one, between literatures from democratization theory and then social movements. And I think this is incredibly important to kind of highlight and bring out empirical research like Nancy Bermeo's and others that testifies to the fact that on the one hand, more mobilization and kind of mass participation is not a threat to democracy, and also on the other hand that previous episodes of democratic breakdown were not because of the ordinary man, but because of elite pacts. So I think that is the broad contribution where I think this book is relevant. And then the other one is also in, this is a very macro kind of structural thesis, which I think that a lot of the attention in the book is given actually to the meso level, so to speak, so the actors' perceptions, and I think that's really valuable. So we see through the book's chapters how these kind of relational, emotional, cognitive mechanisms, as Donatella says, bring about an increased capacity to affect institutional processes and help create a more inclusive culture. And by extension, we are led to believe by this argument that this will will have an effect on more favorable conditions in the future development of democracy. So in other words, I think it's a restatement of a claim also made by Robert Fishman, which basically said the opposite of what democratization literature argued. So democratization literature said pacted transitions, where you have moderate elites from the opposition and from the regime joining hands, that this will be the most successful outcome for democratization, and this was quoted in the example of Spain, versus those where you have ruptures, which are supposedly less favorable. And Fishman proved the opposite, looking at that same pair of cases. And I think a lot of the model that's developed in this book follows this argument, and I think it's very well made. Now, the kind of the point where I would have a bit of a kind of a critique of how the story then comes back to the macro level, is I think that in the transitology literature on the mode of transition, their theorizing focuses on from the moment of regime change to consolidation, which is not always defined in the same way, but it's either about all of the main actors, political actors, playing by the rules, meaning democracy becomes, as Przeworski said, the only game in town, or Huntington said, when we have the two turnover test, when twice you have a change in government and everybody plays by the rules. So I mean, in the original thesis, there is a kind of an end point, and in this book, there isn't really, right? So you have a claim where I think you're actually extending the strength of this mechanism of the mode of transition perhaps a bit too far, in the sense that from the reading of the chapters, it may seem as if the mode of transition will influence the type of democracy all through today, which I think is difficult to maintain, particularly if we want to always be bringing it back to this meso level. And then it's kind of a B point to the same argument. You also say that the mode of transition may have helped the fact that the Czech Republic and the former GDR have a better political economy that ensued. And I think that's also quite difficult, really, to argue, because these two countries, or what used to be Czechoslovakia and GDR, were actually the richest prior to the mode of transition as well. So there's kind of an indigeneity in that. Maybe some kind of, I don't know, but I know it's difficult to kind of account for all these different theoretical influences, but I would, had I, been part of this, I would have wanted to see more of a kind of a political economy approach, which would have said, which would have accounted for the fact that many of these economies look very similar, despite all of that. So just keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena.
Yes. 1 month.
Where does the microphone go now?
You're free to speak up.
Yes. I think some of the answers will address different questions. So I try to go not questions by questions, but making some points that I think address them. So which type of change in the analytic perspective we need when we look at this type of processes is, I think, a very relevant methodological questions which I encounter and try to address, because I think that much of the theories that we are accustomed to work with is theories which address stable time, normal times. So it is theory which explains phenomena which are structured by existing path of relationship, and in which you can expect some type of rationalities by the actors. What this unexpected event or eventfulness in terms of transformations of structures do is something which in democratization literatures has been addressed by scholars like O'Donnell and Schmidt, when they said transitions are moments in which there is an understructuring of events. So we didn't expect them because they should have not been there if the path of relations had continued to be as in normal times. But there you have a spark, you have some types of trigger that changed all type of processes. And what I found in many of the interviews is that the actors were aware that contingency became more relevant and that there was no way any longer to proceed in a strategic way. So, for instance, interviews on the case of Czechoslovakia at that time. Actors said yes, during those those weeks, we mobilized in the street, and then eventually we met in these theaters, which had become sort of free spaces for the oppositions. We tried to strategize, but we were extremely tired. Revolutions is something that don't let you enough time to sleep, and so not even enough time to think. But also it was so new that there was no previous story, previous script you could refer to. And so I think this is something that really challenges expectations, which can be quite useful in normal time, but are no longer helpful. And this element of the agentic vision, so beyond the determinism, is, I think, much more important in this moment. William Sewell talked of eventful temporality as moment in time in which the events are able to challenge the structures, and I think that this is we are dealing with such a case, and it needs, in fact, sort of methodological transformations in our instruments. Then one question is, how does it happen? So which are really the forms in which it happens? And in the book I use two terms. One is legalization and one is legitimation. I think what is very important in the eventful forms of transitions is the fact that even if just for a short period, but the revolutionary are in power. So it happened in Portugal for a little bit more than 1 year. It happened in Czechoslovakia for 2 years. What happens in this moment is constitutions very often. So there are constitutions which are the results of mobilizations of people during the transitions, and these are, I think, very different from the constitutions which come out from instead pacted type of transitions. And very often the issues that are more relevant for social movements, so rights to mobilize and so on, are also dealt with in different ways in these constitutions. So if you compare the Portuguese constitutions and the Spanish one, you see the differences. And these are elements which are relevant also in the long term, because I think it is true that I run the risk to become determinist myself, even if I don't want to, when I say that there is this sort of legacy, path-dependent type of effects, and you rightly said, when does it stop? And of course, in all these countries, there was competitions between different forces with different ideas, and someone won, and then there were changes, of course. But I think that this element of the constitutions has sort of a long-term effect, and that there is also a process of legitimation, so immaterial constitutions which also tend to have long-term effects. One of the research we just finished now with other colleagues is looking at how memories of transitions affected the anti-austerity protest in 2011 and further on. And it is remarkable that, for instance, if you look at the Spanish versus Portugal cases, how events of which happened in '75 still played a role in terms also of structuring the interactions between different actors in different ways. So I think this is something which says it is not deterministics, everything can change, constitutions can also change, but there is some type of long-term effect which re-emerges in times of crisis. So the memories of transitions, like the memories of 1968, 50 years after, are still relevant and not in a deterministic way, but they produce some type of long-term effect. Maybe I stop here because I think some of the issues I will pick up also with other questions.
Thank you very much. Now we will move to a little bit different theme, I would say, to Barbara and then Jelena in this round.
Okay, thank you. My background is actually cultural anthropology, and my so my background is actually cultural anthropology, and my main focus of interest is anthropology of children and taking children into account as research participants. And maybe it's interesting because in social sciences and humanities, children are usually not asked for opinion. I think of them as muted voices, bystanders in all these things that researchers are studying. And also with social movements, maybe it's interesting in line with what's happening right now in USA with all these walkouts and the students, high school students and even younger children are being mobilized against this gun control. I mean, for gun control, against this constitutional right of owning a weapon. And actually, I wanted to share with you, my talking about childhood, because I was born in 1982 in Ljubljana, in ex-Yugoslavia, and I have my first political memories from the age 7, 8, 9. It's just this time when Yugoslavia was disintegrating, and it's like the very vivid memories I have from TV news, and I don't have them from after or before. It's just this time. And I remember very well the fall of Berlin Wall. I remember very well Ceausescu. I can still see this crowd and his face and this helicopter that came. And my father, he said he's a vampire. And of course I was a child, so I didn't get it was some sort of his joke. So I just took it literally. I actually thought he is a vampire, and he even had these ears sort of a bit. And oddly, then in my memory, there is also Cicciolina in Italian parliament showing off her breasts, just for intermezzo. And then I see Milošević and all these crowds, and also the crowds for referendum for Slovenia's independence. But then I remember very well the first democratic elections in independent Slovenia, and I don't remember so much Milan Kučan, who actually won. I remember this candidate who was called Ivan Kramberger, and he was a very unusual person. He was a bit of eccentric. He was born in Slovenia to a very poor family, but he actually went and lived in Germany. He was like a Gastarbeiter in Germany, and he worked in hospital, and he made some patents to improve this dialysis machine. So he actually earned quite a lot of money from these patents, and he was giving this money to the people in need in Slovenia. He was known among people in Slovenia as the good guy from Negova, it's this place where he's from. And he was like a philanthropist and all that. So he was a candidate for president in Slovenia in the first elections. And he was he had this dark hair, and he had this hat, and he even had a monkey on his shoulders. And so he had these public speeches. He was very popular among people. He was a bit of a populist. He had really good speeches. But having this experience of living in Germany, he was actually a bit cautious. He was telling people you don't know what you are wishing for. Be a bit careful, because what will come after all this. And so he was the third in these first elections. He was the third. He didn't win. And then he wanted to be a candidate for the parliament. And what happened, I don't know if anybody knows. Of course, he got assassinated. And it was the assassination was really done under weird circumstances, because they said there was some drunk guy who killed him, from I don't know, really big distance. And it was all suspicious, but this never got cleared out anyway. And there were like some evidence even that there were more people in this room, and that he was so drunk that he just couldn't shoot this guy, like, you know. So anyway, so he was dead. And then maybe just like to elaborate on that, because my husband, he's from Slovakia. He was born in 1977 in Czechoslovakia. And he also, we were like discussing, and he also told me, okay, he was in high school when all these things were happening. And he also didn't get it, like, what's, when all of a sudden Czechoslovakia is gone, like, why nobody asked them anything? And he wanted to go to study to Prague. And so he couldn't go to study to Prague because he wanted to study photography, and then he ended up studying economy in Bratislava, which is his lifelong frustration. So when he was in high school, he actually wrote a letter to the president with all these arguments against this falling apart of Czechoslovakia, which he, of course, never sent. But just like interestingly, like they also had one candidate who was very similar to Ivan Kramberger, and he was also cautioning people, like, you don't know what's like capitalism, like what it will look like. And he also died under weird circumstances in like, so this is like my earliest memory of how democracy was introduced in our countries. And actually I was like, when I read your book, I was interested in, like, if in order for such social movements as it was in the Eastern Europe and the Arab Spring to be successful, is there like needed an external factor, like a push factor, which in my opinion is like that it was not so much like gaining democracy, but more opening up of these countries to the free market economy. I also have memories of like these shopping malls open up. Maybe we can end this like before we were going to shopping to Austria and Italy, but maybe I can share this during coffee break. Like.
So thank you for being here and for allowing us this opportunity to not only to discuss your book, but also to discuss many topics that come out from the book and that we all find quite relevant. And what I want to talk, I mean, usually we use these seminars as platforms not really to discuss, not only to discuss arguments and the qualities of the book, but also to discuss some ideas that emerge from the book, some things that the book or the text we're discussing inspire us. So I'm going to take this pattern. I'm going to allow myself to kind of... But I will, however, start from two quotes from your book, because I wanted to address one particular problem that you also addressed in this book, and this is the transformative emotional intensity of protest. So in one place, somewhere in the beginning, you say, while cognitive visions, emotional feelings, and relational expectations change at the end of eventful democratization, I expect that the democratic framing developed in action, the feeling of empowerment, and the impressions of intense time will remain relevant experiences for those who lived them. And much later on, you also write, at the micro level, deep-rooted consequences of participation in social movements have been identified in research on the biographical consequences of activism, which has confirmed the persistent effects of socialization in social movements in terms of individuals' values and norms. And this is what I want to address, because we're also witnessing this the importance of effective turn in social sciences and humanities, and everybody's talking about how it is important to take notice of affects, of emotions, and how being involved in protests kind of transform individuals. And so I want to now recount a story from 2011. I think 2011, 2012, it was the time of Occupy movement in Sukoti Park. There was a very famous a writer and intellectual, quite famous writer and intellectual from Croatia, who visited. She was here in Belgrade, and we organized together an event. And she was telling about Sukoti Park. She was in New York, and she had this a bit cynical, ironical stance, you know. And she was telling, "Oh, I exited the tube in New York, and then I asked the passerby, where is the revolution? And he told me just around the corner to the left. So I went there and I saw the revolution. Everybody laughed at the audience. It was a funny moment. And I was outraged, not outraged, but I was trying to have a dialogue with her, and I said, but no, it's so important, you don't understand. It's just that for the first time in the United States, they're talking about social injustices, they're talking about inequalities, they even talk openly about socialism. This change of vocabulary and of grammar is something very important. It is indeed revolutionary, it's really an important change. Well, the problem is that I don't think so anymore, because time has passed, and it's true, vocabularies have changed, grammar has changed a lot, we have the whole atmosphere has changed, we talk about it a lot, and we have many lacunas in academia, in artistic spaces, when you can actually claim that there's a hegemony of leftists and activists, not in here definitely, no, but in many Western countries, academia is, there is definitely hegemony of leftist or leftist liberal thought. But nothing has changed, right? So we don't see any institutional changes. So we are kind of, I mean, I'm wondering whether this deceiving sense of empowerment, I mean, I wonder whether this sense of empowerment, of emotional empowerment, is it deceiving? And sometimes we also, you know, tap on each other's shoulders, and, you know, we're activists, we're doing things, but we're doing it in a way that we are distancing ourselves from the real politics. Like, and all this stuff, yesterday I was kind of a bit, also during one panel, critical about enthusiasm regarding prefigurative politics also as well, because especially about when these, this notion which precedes the idea of prefigurative politics, that our methods should reflect the goals that we're striving to achieve. The problem is that we live in these late capitalism, neoliberalism, however we want to call it. It kind of accentuates many contradictions that we have. I mean, human beings are contradictory, that's a human condition, but I think that in these times especially, it's highlighted our contradictory choices. And then if you take this path of righteousness, right? We want to develop lifestyles that reflect goals they want to achieve, then it gives rise to moralistic, paternalizing, preaching tones, you know, and then this is the cause of rifts, many rifts within the left, like, you're not leftist enough, you're not, what you're doing is actually neoliberalism. What you're preaching, the books that you're reading, right? So it's kind of, any meaningful conversation is, you know, you cannot have it. And also we are dealing with these carnivalesque, I would say, I don't know, politics of carnivals and of artistic things, but we are not really doing real politics. We don't go into elections, and we don't, I mean, the idea is, maybe things have changed, but I think the one constant thing throughout the human history is that in order to change politics, you have to influence power relations, you have to change them, you have to seize the institutions, right? So it's kind of, it's not a question, not a comment, it's just what I was thinking about while reading your book.
Thank you. Should I go? Thank you. They're both interesting questions. One more about the past and the ways in which it is remembered, and the other more about the future. So about your memory and memory in general, I think in fact they are quite relevant to analyze, because they tend to consolidate in time, they tend to be selective, but they are also changing at times. So what you can do with memories tend to change according to the different times. As I mentioned, I'm working now on Memories of 68. And there you add a consolidation of memories towards a certain vision of the event, that it was mainly students, that it was mainly counterculture, and that it was only successful in addressing freedom, not social justice. But I think that this memory is now changing. So the interviews in which it is also interesting to see how people who were children then or not born yet remember an event, because there is also the collective side of memories that they didn't participate to, and how others tend instead to remember these type of events, those who participated in it, but who remember now in different way than maybe they did for the 40th anniversaries or the 30th anniversaries. So I think the memory of the events are important also because there is not an event which is successful per se and capable of influencing future movements automatically, but there is always this interpreted type of events, so that some defeats can be interpreted in such a way that it doesn't depress, but rather becomes a sort of heroic moment. So I think that the element of the memory and how it is worked out is very important. I was just to give an examples of the long-term effect of memories, reading research on the Pegida and the anti-Pegida protest in Germany. And for the Pegida protest, one of the point of reference is 1989, especially the shift from the slogan Wir sind das Volk to Wir sind ein Volk, and the type of movement towards assimilations within the western side of Germany. But for the anti-Pegida, and I was very surprised because it was a research done last year's, not this year's, 68 was a point of reference. And of course it was for many of the members of the anti-Pegida protest who were millennials or that generations, a sort of memories which was transmitted in different ways. So I think it's interesting to look at that. About your disillusionment with the revolutions. Of course, also in the interviews, the activists often presented this frustration, disillusionment, especially vis-à-vis expectations which had been and still are presented in terms of nothing will be the same any longer, but then dealing with the fact that in Egypt it was clearly a shift not towards democracies, but from one authoritarian regimes to the next, and maybe even more bloody one. And what the activists said resonated a bit with your comments, because they said that the conceptions of the revolutions could be dangerous because revolutions are perceived to be moment. So one activist in Egypt said, we were wrong because we thought the revolution is a moment. In reality, the revolution is a process. So what we were doing and watching was a moment in a longer process. While the idea of the revolutions make people impatient and give them the impressions that they can change things very quickly and dramatically, what you need is locating this moment within a broader type of perspective. And in this sense, I don't see the prefiguration moment as say discouraging engagement with politics and power. There were clear differences between Occupy in the United States and 15 de Mayo or the so-called Indignados in Greece. But I think that's in different ways also referring to what I was observing in the morning about movement parties. In both movements there were either more pragmatic wings or anyhow the even prefigurative moment prompted attention to power politics. So Sanders is, even in the United States, to a large extent an outcome of the Occupy movement, and it was not prefigurative politics, but it was very pragmatic and to a large extent even skilled in the use of new technologies. I remember, and give this example and then we move on, a colleague coming from 68 background who said he was supporting En Común in Barcelona, and he was interviewed by the media in the very beginning of the process, and he was surrounded by other activists of the new generation who sent him messages saying, be concrete. Don't address two questions in the same times. Be clear about what you say. So knowing communication strategies, and these were the young people who told, don't talk ideology, but so I think that this movement was to a certain extent also difficult to understand because it had this strong moral and prefigurative type of attitudes, but at the same time it was extremely pragmatic then in the development within electoral forms.
Well, I'll be brief, because I feel now under pressure because of the time, space. But well, first of all, I envy you for being in Berlin in that particular period of time, because I'm sure it was quite an experience. What I liked about your book is that you mention both structural factors and also the role of the actors, that you of course acknowledge the importance of the path dependency, but you don't write about you don't write about determinisms, that you think that of course structural factors influence greatly this maneuvering space of the elite, but it's still the choices of elites matters. And from that perspective, I have one question. Why, in your opinion, why was the democratic movement in Tunisia successful and not in other countries of the region? If I'm not mistaken, we have here a relatively similar structural context, and maybe it is Tunisia then the clear example that the choices of elites really matter, that they can play a key role in this process. And the second question, you mentioned the research on Pegida, and have you done recently any research on these new social movements, something that Danijela already mentioned, or the book from Zilonka about this counter-revolution and these new social movements, not only in Western Europe like Pegida or this Western European identitarian movement that is based on this notion of ethnic homogeneity, but also the social movements in Eastern Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, not only regarding this notion of ethnic and cultural homogeneity, but also the war on gender. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, my comment and question takes its cue from Filip's and maybe elaborates it a little bit. I was also very interested in your analysis of the Arab Spring, and also how it is connected to your general thematization of effectivity within the processes of movement formation and democratic mobilization. And then, of course, there was this concluding remark in your book where you mentioned that the actual quality, democratic quality of the regimes that came in the aftermath of the revolutions depended heavily, of course, on also the interplay between the movements seeking democratization and responses of the regimes in the cases of the Arab Spring. And then you compare Tunisia and Egypt, and of course you remark that in Egypt the degree of violence perpetrated by the regime influenced the democratic quality of the movement and the regime in the afterwards, of course the Muslim Brotherhood regime and all the sad developments in Egypt after especially the coup d'etat and everything. Now, what sprang to my mind when reading that were, of course, the even tougher cases of the Arab Spring, Libya and Syria. And, of course, but before I turn to that, just a short general remark. Basically, it seems to me that you're also making an argument that the democratic quality of a given movement depends on the level of emotional investment, emotional attachment to democratization, especially the example of the GDR that you make. And then, in the case of the Arab Spring, my general question is, first of all, do you think that the success in Tunisia and Egypt, the relative success in Egypt, of course, had to do also with the successful interweaving of two imperatives within the protest movements, the imperatives of democratization and imperatives of social justice? And then my more specific question is, when we have a situation, an extreme situation, let's say a situation such as the one in Libya and Syria, where regimes resort to extreme violence, primarily in order to, let's say, undermine the democratic potentials of the movements opposing them, because once they resort to extreme violence, they sort of force the citizens protesting to homogenize, to organize vertically, to take up weapons, to respond violently. And then in such circumstances, of course, it's quite natural to expect that anti-democratic elements will prevail, Islamist elements, authoritarian elements. Do you think that in extreme circumstances, it's very important for the movement to preserve emotional attachment to democratization, emotional attachment to complexity, to heterogeneity, to deliberation, to collective will formation? And then, of course, because the issue arises, how does one achieve that in those extreme circumstances? What springs to mind is the example of Syrian Kurds and the quite fascinating ability to preserve a simultaneous attachment to democratization and social justice in this segment of the Syrian revolution. And what would be your view on how to interweave different ideals to preserve emotional investment in democratization in extreme circumstances? That's the question.
Yes, I start to sympathize with Judith Butler. I will try to be coherent, nevertheless. No, I agree with your first statement. I feel very lucky that I was in Berlin in that time. My previous historical experience had been in Paris when I was doing my master, and Mitterrand was elected. At that point, Mitterrand, French socialist, being elected in France seemed an historical experience, but then Berlin was really overwhelming, and also the possibility to be there. In fact, one of the effects is a German husband and an apartment in Berlin, which I remain very, very attached to Berlin. So what I wanted to say, addressing your questions, but also other questions which have been mentioned, is what I think one could do in terms of explanations in these cases, which are for sure extremely complex to explain. So also Daniela says political economy type of contextual characteristics also play a role, and in fact it is true, and I couldn't deal with all of them. In fact, from the methodological point of view, I say I don't want to explain the entire processes of democratizations, but more focus on how one dimension, variable if you want to use that language, has an impact. So I'm sure that many other events played and dimension played a role, and especially I couldn't in this book go so much into the details of the type of reactions by the regimes. I have just a chapter on repression, but I think that it is a process in which, in fact, many different actors play a role. There is another book which I co-authored with other colleagues, which is called When Struggles for Democratization Fail. And we address Syria, Libya, Yemen, and also former Yugoslavia, because former Yugoslavia was the case in which one expected to have an easy democratization in that period, because all the contextual elements, more liberalized type of regimes, traditions of civil society and so on was there, but developed in very troubled and complex forms of long-term processes of democratizations. And what we do in this book is also to revisit two literature, one on civil wars, because this was the case probably to a lower extent even in Egypt, and also literature on non-violent revolutions and which are the conditions for keeping them non-violent. And when comparing 1989 with 2011, what was clear was also that the degree of violence used by the incumbents, by the regimes then, was much lower in 1989. It wasn't lower because in Central Eastern Europe, I mean, it wasn't necessarily lower because of the intentions of the dictators, but I followed it in the development of some of these events, like the Montag demonstrations in Lipsia, where the GDR tried to mobilize all the possible police forces. But they couldn't mobilize the militia because the people were too much involved. So the relatives of people in the militias were in the squares, and they couldn't mobilize they couldn't mobilize international army because Gorbachev had developed in another direction. So all this means it is very relevant also the reactions by the others and the position of the military, which I think is also something which helps explaining the different type of evolutions in Tunisia and in Egypt, where in Egypt the military did not fully support the repression by Mubarak, but then tried to keep power and privileges, which were very strong in Egypt more than in Tunisia. Another elements of differentiation between Tunisia and Egypt is exactly at the level of constitutional politics and elections. So in Tunisia there was an agreement which was not only among the elites but was also the elites towards agreeing on the constitutions and then having the elections. The development of constitutional process in Egypt was a disaster because it was done after elections, so that the elections had much less legitimacy and much less type of broad support. And the stories of interactions between social movements, Islamic religious movements, and other type of more left-wing movement was different in the two countries. I think also what was important in Tunisia was the mobilizations of the trade unions, which were capable of giving some input to the process towards a more peaceful type of development. So without going in the details of the process, I think that in fact, in order to explain the different developments, one needs to look at the broad pictures with different actors who intervene in the process. Also, the international actors were relevant and played a very different role in 1989 and in 2011. Yes, I think.
Okay, and final round, Tiziano. Yes,
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, thank you to be here and to give me the possibility to discuss with you face to face. And well, your book, and in particular the parts devoted to the relevance of oral histories and to the importance of the emotions which are at stake in each revolution and in each democratization process, let me think to the individual integration in a social movement. I mean, to the intensity of the feeling to belong to a social movement. The first keynote lesson of this conference, given by Professor Jansen, faced with passionate insistence the issue of the role of an activist. He said, I'm an activist because I choose to be an activist and I act when I can, out of the time of my work, in my free time. This is really relevant for me because, as you wrote in your book, this decision influences the way to which reality is judged and perceived by someone who is an activist, and also the way through which personal life and personal identity take form. We could say being part of a social movement is a very strong and important decision because it modifies our understanding of the world and also our daily life. In religious terms, we could say that it is a real sacrifice in its very etymological sense. From that perspective, thinking properly to this decision and the process through which someone belonged to a movement, it seemed to me that social movements are always very particular. Particular means here placed in time and space, with a specific target and with particular aims. We could say that the reason of the existence of a social movement is basically the opposition to something in order to achieve a better condition in terms of social rights, political rights, or human rights, as you wrote. And social movement, and therefore a negative existence, because they live like shadows or bacterium within a society. They react. They are a kind of immunity system preventing or fighting regimes. From this perspective, and this is my question, I was wondering what kind of social movement is, in your opinion, the one which aims at modifying a global situation and not a situated particular situation? Is it possible this kind of movement is it different from the social movements and from the democratization processes you analyzed? What kind of engagement is possible in those cases in front of global issues like, for example, labor or work metamorphosis, environment and climate changes, or liberalism and neoliberalism politics? Thank you.
Okay. I already presented myself many times. I've skipped this time. I would like to connect what is, I think Marjan just touched upon this issue, but also with your lecture you gave us this morning about this tendency, and we also observed that in our research of the social movements to organize, to push for organizing more deliberative participatory way, which I think it's necessary, because even from my personal point of view, if you want to make part of social movement, I would not accept to be integrated in some kind of vertical organization that does not promote democratic values. But then on the other hand, when we talk about, and this is where Marjan tackled this issue, about the movements that need to decide in specific conditions like revolutions, they need to make decisions very quickly and not really in democratic ways. I know you don't have answer to that, but this is the issue that I'm interested in very much, because I would sustain and I would promote always organization in the deliberative way. And okay, and the other thing I was, and it relates to this question actually, is what you, because I didn't study that much right-wing movements. I'm interested from your empirical research, because I know you touch upon those issues and you did in your research center this research. What do they also have these tendencies now to organize in more deliberative way? Because from really few information I have about those movements, I see that they also are now recently promoting this this kind of horizontal organization.
Thank you. Just okay, single issues or broader issues, and to which extent you have global type of movements. I think the movement addressed in the book had an internal tensions. On the one hand, the need to try to develop broad coalition and so stressing the issues of democratizations as a common background. But also in this movement you could see what in social movement studies is called scale shift. So a scale shift in the sense of developing visions which went beyond the characteristics of a single state, but also a scale shift in the sense of imagining an alternative world. So it was not just the democratizations, and in fact the reasons why many of the activists we interviewed were disappointed was that you could say they won democratization processes which were also high qualities in terms of being non-violent, quite fast, and also from the economic point of view to a certain extent successful. But they were disappointed on the one hand by the fact that it was the Western model which was taken over, not the alternative model that they had tried to develop. And they were disappointed by the fact that their visions of justice was betrayed during the transition to democracies. So in these movements there was an encounter of claims of freedoms with claims of social justice, and the idea by activists that they could imagine alternative type of words. So revisiting the socialist with the human face that had been promoted in '68 in Czechoslovakia and so on. And the disillusionment was in the fact that Western democracy was not really what they were struggling for. Also, I think that there, in order to understand these tensions and dynamics, one has to consider that there are different actors also within the movements themselves. So what you had in 1989 was the mobilizations of small groups of civil societies which were not really able to control the process. So if you follow the German case, take the German case as an illustration. There were the activists of Civic Forum and other groups that developed these alternative visions, but they were a small group, and their own perceptions was that they lost grasps of the mass mobilizations quite soon. And so for them, one of them said, for me, the two most difficult moments in my life was when the Berliner Wall was built and when it was broken and when it was destroyed, because the perceptions by the activists was towards constructing an utopia, a different type. So it was global, but movement for democratizations built up coalitions in which not all the people who mobilized wanted the same type of things. I think this is related indeed with the issues of deliberation in free spaces, because it is true what I said. Many activists said we don't have time in that moment to reflect, discuss, and so on. But it is also true that these processes created a lot of free spaces, and that the very characteristics of these free spaces were important in terms of the survival of some ideas of the revolution. So just one line of comparison I developed in the book is between Czechoslovakia and Poland. Counterintuitively, Poland was the countries in which there was, in the beginning of the 80s, a big protest. Solidarność was able to involve a large amount of people. But with the martial law, the church got more and more space as a free spaces, as the only way and space of protections of the activists. And the Polish Catholic Church had some characteristics, for instance, different from the Protestant churches that in the GDR offered free space as well. And very different was also in Czechoslovakia, the theaters. So the fact that in Czechoslovakia was much more the intellectuals and that these free spaces were free spaces with other types of values that those of the Catholic Church in Poland also played a role. So I think that there were these free spaces which were spaces for deliberation as well. And then there was a moment which I think was important for this type of deliberations, which was really the moment of transitions in which the old institutions were no longer there and the new institutions had not developed yet, in which in similar ways, the activists in the GDR described this 1 year after the breaking down of the regimes and before the celebrations of the reunification, in which also at the local level, the old mayors and apparatuses were no longer there. The citizens entered into this with building a sort of Bürgerinitiative to manage. And this was a very creative type of moment. In Czechoslovakia, in the first 2 years, the activists of social forums were in power, and they said, we arrived with a lot of enthusiasm, ideas, and possibilities to develop these ideas. But these are moments, and so I think that it is space for deliberations as well, but under some types of conditions. It's not the Habermasian rationality, it's a much more passionate type of politics.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the discussants and also you for answering. I know it's really exhausting sometimes to answer so many questions, but if you allow me, I would like to open the floor to the audience for some questions, comments. We have some time.
I'm Stanja Petkovska, PhD in Cultural Studies, and currently I'm an independent researcher. I wanted to say we've heard a lot about revolution, democracy, and social movements, but what we didn't hear a lot about is capitalism and imperialism. And also I was wondering, by reading your book, how this goes with your analysis and with all those transformations. That's all. Thank you.
Do you want to Yes, I think it was important in different ways in the two periods. In both cases, what was important was also the role of great power, which also means the control coming from the imperialist center into the periphery. And there I think it was important in explaining also the different developments in the two areas that in 1989 there had been already a strategic shift in the Soviet Union, and this was one of those, we can say, contingent type of changes which had an impact on the development of the process. So I talked and the interviews with the pastors that in Lipsia were very relevant in the organizations of the Monday demonstrations, and what they in their perceptions it was a moment, especially one of the biggest Monday demonstrations, in which they were ready also for a Tiananmen type of solutions. Tiananmen was also in that period, and the pastors also said, together with the other activists, they did what they could in order to avoid violence. So, for instance, they explained that also some of the choreography going with the candles. So they said, if you have 2 candles in your hands, you cannot fight with the police. And it is a choreography that is they trying to avoid escalations. But of course, nobody could say what would have happened if the GDR regimes had succeeded in mobilizing either the support of Soviet Union or also support inside Czechoslovakia, because there also the paradoxical things was that both GDR and Czechoslovakia were the, let's say, the most authoritarian types of regimes in Central Eastern Europe. So these changes in the hegemonic dominations is relevant. And in terms of capitalism, I think it is also very relevant. Probably there is something in the book on two different aspects of capitalism. One after the transitions to democracy. So Central Eastern Europe has been the areas in which experiments of neoliberalism were played with the support of the European Union and of various think tanks and so on. It was what was defined as double type of transitions, because it was a transition from authoritarianism to democracy, but also from states to free market, and this development of free market solutions was something that produced a lot of frustrations among the activists. In the case of the Arab Spring, the neoliberal development had preceded the development of the democratization movement, and this together with the fact that the regimes were neoliberal ones and not states dominated ones, also produced some specific type of developments with a lot of protests that had been going on in different moments, both in Egypt and in Tunisia, against neoliberalism, against the shift from a developmentalist type of states into and so I think that it is a relevant sort of considerations, because it is always movement that, since they are broad, they address not only the issues of political power, but also the issues of economic power.
Question?
No,
or well, there are several things which were crossing my mind when I was reading the book, and maybe I would like to connect it a little bit with also your more recent research about movement parties, and also with the figure of scholar in all this. Basically, when you were researching 1809, I have impression that the people who engaged there, those movements, they were struggling to come out from one very critical situation at that point for them, and to move to, let's say, they had a vision that they will move to more stable democratic system, which was somehow desired for them. I wouldn't say utopia, because it was not so far, but let's say heading toward such a vision. Maybe we could argue also that it was similar in Arab Spring, that obviously those regimes were least democratical regimes. But I would like to connect with another thing, with experience which I had here, for example, with the movement Do Not Drown Belgrade. We had some interviews with them, and the thing they are emerging in one, let's say, really neoliberal context. With a strong political elite which is corrupted, which is capturing the state in a way, and where in environment where all findings which we have says that citizens are completely disillusioned and not willing to engage in any way. So basically we have a small group of people who are engaging, but a huge majority of people who are staying out of the not only political arena, meaning they are not going to vote at all. We have very high very high percentage of people who are not voting at all at elections, but also we have but in general they are not engaging anywhere, not only in the elections. But from another perspective of view, we have some local movement, and Do Not Drown Belgrade started as a local movement here in Belgrade, and there are also a few more examples which we have in Serbia, but also Zagreb and Naš can be somehow connected to this one. And when we were talking to them, there is a kind of, we would say, pragmatic approach, at least in some parts of those movements, because they are among themselves, they are not really synchronized completely how they should proceed and what they should do, which is saying we do not want to go or tackle ideological issues, because we think that will really polarize people, and then we are aiming to change first the local community and to tackle those small questions which we believe all agree upon, and then we will move from that point of view. We will build little by little step, we will build our, let's say, position as someone who achieved something in the local level, who has a credibility, which is definitely the word which is lacking in political scene for the moment, because the research which we did say that politics and credibility, that's like completely opposite, doesn't have anything common, and we will build our position slowly, and then we will introduce the things which we believe are important from also ideological point of stance, which are connected to social justice, to equality or inequality, depends, and then we will try to, let's say, act from within the system to change the system, which is the thing I really liked, because somehow they are trying to they are learning on the lessons which we had, that revolutions, even if we are able to organize revolution, which we are not obviously at this point, because it's not happening, those revolutions are really like short-sighted, because when they enter institutions quickly, as we pointed out today, the things stop there, so they become captured in the institutions. And I just wanted to ask you whether your experience from the based empirical data which you have point somehow in this recent movement that there is a similar thing like this one, or this is maybe something specific to this region or not. I'm really interested in that. And another question is, well, when I'm writing, because I'm writing about intellectuals and the impact which they might have, or maybe we believe they have, because it's really impossible to answer whether they have or not. I'm always thinking, for example, your book or all your work is really valuable thing for somebody who is engaged in the practical things, who is practitioner in some way. And I'm completely aware that people who are in movements which are very, you need to act really fast, they are not able to follow, or they are not able to read and then think what we should do, learn from the lessons or not. But if they are moving a step further, and if they are becoming a party, movement party or regular party, or they are stepping in the party, I guess that's one type of slowing down the process. So it's not so fast as it's when you have street protests or something like that. Do you believe that your work or any work of us here has any influence on these processes, that they really somehow, not through your books maybe, but through your public, I mean, appearing or writing something in the media or something, has any influence on them? That's you have a holiday.
They have a holiday. Yes, both very interesting and difficult questions. The one about the thinking small, which seems to be as a sort of alternative to the thinking big of the revolutions. I think that it is much broader than just in Eastern Europe or in the Balkans, because it is indeed one of the reactions also within social movements to frustrations, which is always there. So, for instance, in the Spanish case, after the people moved away from the squares, from the acampadas, they returned a lot to neighborhood politics. As we mentioned sometimes this morning, for social movements, it is easier to contest elections at the local level than at the national one, and it is easier to remain loyal to horizontal participatory forms of participation. So this is there. The thinking small, and it is also there, I think, because in different degrees and different forms, but it also responds to a difficulties of using left and right as categories that you can easily communicate. And I think that this has some specificities in former socialist countries because of the stigmatizations of some of the language of left given real socialism. But I think maybe together with the real socialist type of stigmatizations, there was then a lot of confusions after transitions with the fact that in many countries left-wing parties became extremely neoliberal type of parties, ideologically, but also pragmatically, because they exploited the occasions of privatizations. This was the story in the GDR and so on. So they enriched themselves, and so to a certain extent, I think also this part of the story is similar in other geographical areas, even if it is as a specific type of characteristics in post-socialist countries. But if you take the Five Stars movement, for instance, it is an example of this thinking small and thinking about the concrete problems of the people, then scaling up to more general type of discourses, acquiring also spaces for innovations, creation. And it is interesting that also someone like Sanders, for instance, developed his careers and ideas through engagement as mayor of relatively small cities. So these creative potentials. For the 3 minutes for the intellectuals, I have always personally difficulties in thinking about myself as a sort of organic intellectual, even if I often experience moments of activism in my life, but I think that I would feel it too arrogant on my side to give lessons to activists, because I think that you always need mediators. So you need real activists to pick up some ideas and develop them, knowing much more than me about the type of politics that they are engaged with. But at the same time, what I also see is that activists read a lot, and they read also our work. So I just received an email by junior colleagues of mine who went in Colombia interviewing former guerrillas, and he told me, I think you will be happy to know that they have read your work. It happened to me with Palestinian activists. So I think that's there is much more attention than sometimes is feared, because there is in social movement studies a debate in which scholars often says, well, our work is useless, is not used, we should engage more and so on. I think, yes, we should engage more, but I think that there are different type of perspectives, and that's activists always or often make use of our work. Also because sometimes I think there is a sort of cross-fertilizations between activists and scholars which come from overlapping membership. So Podemos developed within university in Madrid, and Común developed within universities in Barcelona. And if I find, as I found out, that Pablo Iglesias is resonating a lot with what I'm saying, is probably because he's reading my work, but maybe is resonating also because I read his own work. So I think that there is in interactions, and that yes, it could develop even more within sort of normalizations of politics, but I think that there is also a lot in during moments of protest, and that for activists there is this self-reflections which pushes them often to engage with sociological work, with normative works and so on. I always remember a Sunday morning in which activists from the European social forums invited me to talk to them about deliberative democracy. And it was a very nice May Day in Florence. I expected nobody was going to come, and instead it was an entire afternoon debating deliberative democracies. So I think that there is this interest. Thank you.
Could I just try and answer your question? Because you mentioned well, the way I understood your question was that this is an internal conversation going on within the Daimlerberger, right, about how whether we should postpone bigger ideological questions for later, because we first need to talk to people and kind of respond to their immediate concerns and things like that. This is, of course, the conversation that we were having and are still having, but I would restate it a little bit. I would say that, you know, the way we are thinking about it is in Croatia, you have something that's called a dominant cleavage, meaning that politics works along recognized lines, where on the one hand you have nationalism and social conservatism, Catholicism, and the opposition to that. And this is how politics is understood. This is what's resonant. So every time you raise any of these issues, you have immediate reflex of who's on the left and who's on the right. And if you want to change that, if you want to change the conversation, you have to start from, as we understand this anyway, from immediate concerns of life, but which are material. This is not about postponing what is, issues of social justice and equality. It's the immediate questions of social justice and equality, because it's about the quality of your public utilities. It's about right to the city in terms of physical spaces that you use. So it's very immediate, and in that sense, it's concrete. And I think previous struggles, at least in the context of Croatia, and Right to the City, which has a pedigree for 10 years or so, is that it doesn't work to speak about neoliberalism. It just, this is not how you conduct a political conversation. You have to locate it and make it very concrete. But I think it's important for us to be aware of this, so as not to do the mistake of, scholars who expect movements to talk about. If it's not directly capitalism, then it's not anti-capitalist. I think that's where we go wrong.
Maybe I was not specific enough. They of course, I think they are thinking the same. Just they believe that when they are building their discourse or narratives, they will not say, for example, for public utilities or for a lack of the ramps for disabled people that's injustice, or they will say people need that. That's the vocabulary that they would like to use. So not going to any step further to use like social justice as a term at all for the moment, because social justice as a term is labeled as something which is leftist and for the moment not really popular to use. And then let's keep it. People need this. They said that they want this, and we are here to communicate their needs to the level of local governments and to try to provide them what they need, basically.
Right. But I think that's that's the condition for, like, if you're in a weaker position and you're building a counter-hegemonic narrative, that's precisely because you want people who now perceive themselves as on the right to listen to you. And in order to do that, you have to avoid the immediate labels and present yourself as someone who who speaks about something that's relevant to them, and then 3 steps further, in a way. Of course, sometimes it's within one conversation, but in other times and in public forums, it needs some kind of sequential. Yeah, do you want to
just follow on that, because you also said one very important thing, like in Croatia, like in most European countries, there's a clear cleavage, fascist, communist, pro-social, and it's black and red. In Serbia, it's a total mess. It's not only that we have socialism as a heritage, we also have Milačić as a heritage. So many people saw him as some kind of continuation of communism. That was the banner under which he was overthrown in 2000. Was finally we overthrew communism, even though it's, of course, Milačić's Socialist Party was not really communist party, and first privatization laws were actually under his rule. So it's complete chaos, and here we have the way historical revisionism is currently taking place in Serbia. It's also funny because now we have Chetnik movement, which they were collaborators during the Second World War. They're now together. They're officially recognized as resistant movement, together with partisan movement. So this division, right and left, it's absolute chaos. So you have to be very careful when addressing issues in ideological terms, because, for instance, one of the most nationalistic parties in Serbia are called Socialist Party, Party of the Left, or what, a progressive party, and everything is very much messy. So that's why you have to be very, very careful. And even though, and do not let Belgrade down, they are increasingly now using ideological sort of language, but you have to be very careful because it's chaotic things here.
Jelena was participating on the list in the Belgrade City Council election on the Do Not Drown Belgrade list. But anyway, I would like to thank you for your inputs, and particularly for the answer in the last question, which is encouraging for academics, I would say, especially those who are somehow want to make a change. So I think that is really encouraging. I want to thank you all for your patience, and to invite you now for a short break, 2 hours, and to invite you to the panel in the same place where we had yesterday evening in Artget, Cultural Belgrade Center, for a discussion on 68, basically, with the participants of the 68. So I think it will be really interesting, and it's for us, it's also expectation what they will say and what are the memories, and rephrasing the memories which they have. And just one more important thing, the translation will be provided to English, because they will all speak in Serbian. Obviously some of them are not speaking English, so we provided translation, and it would be nice to see you there also. Thank you very much, and see you in the morning for the lecture of Ugo Matej.